They laughed the first time she stepped into the barracks. Not the good-natured chuckle of camaraderie that often echoed through the halls of Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune, but the sharp cutting kind that slices through a room and leaves silence in its wake. A low, cruel laugh that spread across the room like wildfire in drought-stricken brush. 24 pairs of eyes locked on her face on the jagged lines that ran from her left cheekbone down to her jawline. The scars caught the harsh fluorescent light, a roadmap of pain etched into her skin. Gabriella Reeves, Ella, to the few who earned the right to call her that, stood perfectly still in the doorway. She'd prepared for this moment during the long bus ride to North Carolina, rehearsed her response to the inevitable stares. But preparation and reality seldom align, and the weight of their judgment pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Sergeant Michael Dawson stepped forward, his 6'2" frame blocking the overhead light. His shadow stretched across the polished floor between them, a dark bridge she had no desire to cross. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room. "Looks like someone took battle scars a little too literally before even getting to boot camp." Another round of laughter, louder this time, emboldened by their leader's approval. 27 years old with 3 tours in Afghanistan under his belt, Dawson carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew exactly where he stood in the world. And right now, he stood directly between Ella and any chance of acceptance. She could have responded, could have told him that those scars had been earned not in battle, but in something far more personal. Instead, she straightened her spine, squared her shoulders, and looked him directly in the eye, a silent challenge that caught him off guard. "Private Reeves reporting for assignment, Sergeant," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil beneath her composed exterior. Something flickered in Dawson's eyes, surprise perhaps at her composure before his face hardened again. "Third bunk on the left. Try not to scare anyone in their sleep." More laughter, but she was already moving, her footsteps measured and deliberate. She felt their eyes tracking her every movement, heard the whispers that weren't meant to be subtle. By nightfall, she knew there would be a dozen cruel nicknames competing for dominance. She had expected this, had known it would be this way. But knowledge doesn't dull pain, it only prepares you to endure it. As she stowed her gear in the metal locker beside her bunk, she allowed herself 5 seconds, no more, to close her eyes and remember why she was here. Not for them, not for herself even, but for a promise made to a ghost. The morning broke with the jarring blare of a bugle pulling Ella from the shallow waters of sleep. She'd lain awake most of the night listening to the rhythmic breathing of her new squad mates, planning her strategy for the days ahead. Isolation was inevitable, but she couldn't allow it to become exile. She needed allies, or at least the absence of active enemies. "Rise and shine, ladies and gentlemen," Drill Sergeant Daniel's voice boomed through the barracks. "First day of the rest of your miserable lives, field qualification in 30 minutes. Let's see which of you knows which end of a rifle the bullet comes out of." Ella moved with practiced efficiency, her bunk made to perfection, before most had even thrown off their covers. The morning routine was muscle memory instilled by her father years before she ever considered military service. Marcus Reeves had run his household with military precision, a habit from his years as a decorated Marine, and later as a member of an elite special operations unit during Desert Storm. "Look at Scarface," someone muttered as she headed for the door. "Trying to impress Daddy, I bet. If they only knew." The firing range stretched out before them, 100 yards of precisely arranged lanes, leading to paper targets mounted on wooden frames. The morning sun glinted off the row of M48-5 sniper rifles laid out on the tables, each one a marvel of engineering precision. "Today we evaluate your basic marksmanship skills," announced Staff Sergeant Williams, the range master. "No fancy stuff, no heroics, just you, the rifle, and the target. 5 rounds each. Highest score gets bragging rights and first shower privileges for a week." Ella stood at the end of the line, ignoring the sideways glances and poorly concealed smirks. Her focus narrowed to the rifle before her, identical to the others, yet somehow calling to her hands. The M48-5, 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge, 10-round detachable box magazine, 1,000-yard effective firing range, Schmidt and Bender, 212 by 50 PM2 scope. "Take your positions," Williams ordered. The group moved forward, each recruit claiming a weapon. Ella's hands moved automatically, checking the rifle with practiced precision. The weight felt familiar, an extension of herself rather than a separate entity. "Commence firing when ready." First shot, inhale, half exhale, pause, squeeze. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, a controlled violence she'd known since she was 12 years old. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Breathe with the rifle, Ellie. Let it become part of you. Second shot, third, fourth, fifth, each one following the same rhythm, the same discipline. When she lowered the weapon, she knew without looking that all 5 rounds had found their mark. Not just hit the target, but clustered so tightly at its center that they formed a single ragged hole. The silence that followed was different from yesterday's. This wasn't the quiet of judgment, but of disbelief. Staff Sergeant Williams raised his binoculars, then lowered them slowly. Private Reeves, he said, his voice carefully neutral, care to explain how you just shot a perfect score with grouping that would make a SEAL instructor weep with joy? All eyes turned to her again, but this time with something new in their gaze. Confusion, reassessment, and in Sergeant Dawson's case, the first flickers of unease. My father taught me, Staff Sergeant, she answered, keeping her voice level. Started me on a 22 when I was 10, moved up from there. Williams approached her target, waving the others to follow. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what precision looks like. 5 shots, 1 hole. Private Reeves just set a new record for first day qualification. The murmurs spread through the group, a different kind of fire than yesterday's mockery. Ella caught fragments. Lucky shot and beginner's luck, competing with reluctant admiration. But she wasn't looking for their approval, just their respect. And respect in the military often began at the business end of a rifle. As they filed back toward the barracks, a female recruit fell into step beside her. That was impressive, she said, her voice carrying a slight southern drawl. I'm Rebecca Miller, former Army medic transferred to the Corps last year. Ella studied her briefly, mid-20s athletic build, shrewd blue eyes that missed nothing. Gabriella Reeves, she replied, offering her name as a tentative bridge between them. I know, Rebecca smiled. Word travels fast around here, especially when someone shows up the resident alpha male on day 1. She nodded subtly toward Dawson, who walked ahead of them, his back rigid with wounded pride. Wasn't trying to show anyone up, Ella said. Just did what I was trained to do. Sometimes that's enough, Rebecca replied. Anyway, thought you should know. Not everyone here is an asshole, just most of them. Her smile took the sting from the words. See you at Chow. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was a start. That night, lying in her bunk after lights out, Ella allowed herself to drift back 8 years. The memories came unbidden, as they always did when she closed her eyes. The acrid smell of smoke, the orange glow of flames against the night sky, the frantic screams of her mother as they stood in the front yard of their burning home. Nathan's still inside, her mother had screamed, struggling against her father's restraining arms. My baby's inside. 16-year-old Ella had stood frozen, watching the flames climb higher, consume the second floor where her 12-year-old brother's bedroom was located. Her father had run toward the house, only to be driven back by a wall of heat and collapsing timber. The fire department is coming, he'd shouted, his voice raw with desperation. They'll get him out. But the nearest station was 20 minutes away, and the fire was spreading too quickly. Ella had watched her father's face, seen the moment when calculation overcame hope. Nathan wouldn't survive 20 minutes. What happened next had been instinct rather than decision. One moment she was standing beside her mother. The next she was running toward the house, ignoring her parents' screams. The heat had hit her like a physical wall. As she ducked through the front door, dropped to her knees where the air was marginally clearer. 8 years later, she could still feel the scorching pain as she'd crawled up the stairs, the way her lungs had burned with each smoky breath. The memory of finding Nathan unconscious but alive, of dragging his limp body down the hallway as flaming debris rained down around them. The moment when a burning beam had crashed across her path, pinning her left arm, searing her face with white-hot agony. The certainty in that endless second that they would both die there. And then her father's silhouette in the smoke, lifting the beam with strength born of desperation, carrying both his children to safety. Nathan had recovered completely. Ella had spent months in the hospital enduring skin grafts and reconstructive surgeries that could minimize her scars but never erase them completely. Her left arm bore similar markings, a latticework of healed tissue that told its own story of that night. She hadn't minded the scars. They were proof of choice, of action taken when action mattered. What had haunted her was the look in her father's eyes whenever he saw them. Pride mixed with a guilt that no amount of reassurance could dispel. As if he had failed her somehow by not being the one to reach Nathan first. Now 8 years later, and 3 years after her father's death, Ella traced the raised lines of scarring on her face in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new judgments. But she had faced fire before, and emerge carrying what mattered most. These people, with their stares and whispers, were nothing compared to that night. Sleep came eventually, punctuated by dreams of flame and falling ash. The second week brought their first wilderness survival exercise. 3 days in the dense forest surrounding Camp Lejeune with minimal supplies and maximum pressure. They were divided into four-person teams, and Ella found herself grouped with Rebecca Miller, a quiet recruit named Peterson, and, in what could only be deliberate orchestration, Sergeant Michael Dawson. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Dawson remarked as they assembled their gear. Team Scarface reporting for duty. Rebecca shot him a withering glance. "Original. Did you stay up all night thinking of that one Dawson?" His expression darkened. "Watch it, Miller. I outrank you out here." "And I outrank both of you in field medicine," she countered smoothly. "Remember that when you're bleeding from something stupid." Ella said nothing, focusing instead on checking their supplies. One compass, 4 canteens, basic first aid, flint and steel, 2 tarps, and enough rations for 2 meals each. The rest they would need to forage or hunt. Staff Sergeant Norris Williams approached their group, his expression unreadable. "Your objective is simple. Navigate to these coordinates." He handed Dawson a sealed envelope. "Establish a secure camp and survive until extraction. You'll be evaluated on teamwork, resource management, and problem solving." "Clear." "Crystal Staff Sergeant," Dawson replied, tucking the envelope into his pocket without opening it. "One more thing," Williams added, his gaze lingering on Ella. "There's a storm system moving in from the coast. Flash flood warnings are in effect for the lowland areas. Plan accordingly." They set out at noon, Dawson taking point with the compass, Rebecca behind him, then Peterson with Ella bringing up the rear. The forest swallowed them quickly, its sunlight filtering through the canopy in dappled patterns that shifted with every step. For the first hour, they moved in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Ella watched Dawson's back, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he occasionally glanced at the compass, then changed their direction slightly. By the third such adjustment, she was certain. "We're going the wrong way," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. Dawson stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "Excuse me. We're heading northwest. The coordinates in that envelope are for a location to the northeast." She met his gaze steadily. "You're reading the compass wrong." "And how would you know what's in a sealed envelope, Reeves?" His voice was dangerous quiet. "Because Staff Sergeant Williams tapped his left shoulder twice when he handed it to you. That's the signal for northeast quadrant." She didn't blink. "Standard field communication. My father taught me." Dawson's face flushed red. For a moment, she thought he might strike her. Instead, he tore open the envelope, scanned its contents, then crumpled the paper in his fist. "Northeast it is," he said through clenched teeth, pushing past her to retake the lead. Rebecca fell into step beside Ella. "That was either very brave or very stupid," she murmured. "Just practical," Ella replied. "No point walking in the wrong direction." "You know he's not going to forgive you for showing him up." Again, Ella shrugged. "I'm not here for his forgiveness." By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered overhead, confirming William's warning about the approaching storm. The air grew heavy with moisture pressing down on them like a physical weight. "We need to find higher ground," Ella suggested as the first fat raindrops began to fall. "If there's flash flooding—" "I'm aware of the protocol, Reeves," Dawson cut her off. "There's a ridge about half a click ahead. We'll make camp there." The rain intensified as they pushed forward, turning from gentle drops to driving sheets within minutes. The forest floor became treacherous, slick with mud and hidden roots that threatened to topple them with each step. Peterson went down first, his ankle turning beneath him with an audible crack that made them all wince. "I'm fine," he insisted, though his face had gone pale. "Just give me a minute." Rebecca was at his side immediately, her medical training taking over. "It's not broken, but it's a bad sprain. You're not walking on this tonight." Dawson cursed under his breath. "Perfect. Just perfect." He glared at the darkening sky as if it had personally betrayed him. Miller Reeves helped Peterson. "I'll scout ahead for a suitable campsite." Before anyone could object, he had disappeared into the rain-soaked underbrush, leaving them with their injured teammate. "Typical," Rebecca muttered as she fashioned a makeshift compression wrap from the first aid kit. "When things get tough, Dawson gets going, in the opposite direction." Ella scanned their surroundings, assessing options. "We can't stay here. The ground's already saturating and we're in a natural drainage path." She pointed to the subtle slope of the land around them. "When the real runoff starts, this whole area will be underwater." Peterson tried to stand, his face contorting with pain, despite his efforts to hide it. "I can make it," he insisted, though it was clear he could barely put weight on his injured ankle. "Not fast enough," Ella decided. She unslung her pack, stowing the most critical supplies in her pockets before handing the rest to Rebecca. Take these, find Dawson, and head for higher ground. I'll help Peterson. That's not the protocol, Rebecca objected. We're supposed to stay together. Protocol doesn't account for everything. Ella positioned herself beside Peterson, ducking under his arm to support his weight. Go, we'll follow as fast as we can. Rebecca hesitated, then nodded sharply. Don't be heroes. If it gets too dangerous, find a tree and climb. With that, she turned and headed in the direction Dawson had taken, quickly disappearing into the rain. For the next hour, Ella and Peterson made painfully slow progress up the gradually steepening terrain. The rain had become a constant roar around them, plastering their clothes to their bodies and reducing visibility to mere yards. Worse, Ella could hear the rush of water growing louder behind them, the flash flood warning becoming reality. We need to move faster, she urged, practically carrying Peterson now. The water's rising. Leave me, Peterson gasped, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. Save yourself. Not happening. Her voice left no room for argument. My brother once told me something similar. Didn't listen to him either. They struggled onward, each step a victory against pain and exhaustion. The roaring grew louder and Ella risked a glance back. What she saw froze her blood colder than the rain that soaked them. A wall of muddy water surging through the forest below, tearing down everything in its path. Hold on, she ordered, shifting her grip to better support Peterson's weight. We're about to move a lot faster. Adrenaline lent her strength she didn't know she possessed. Half carrying, half dragging her teammate, she scrambled up the increasingly steep slope, ignoring the branches that whipped against her face, the thorns that tore at her hands. Behind them, the floodwaters gained ground with inexorable certainty. Just as her strength began to fail, the ground leveled out beneath them. They had reached the ridge, but there was no sign of Dawson or Rebecca. Dawson! She shouted into the storm. Miller! Only the howl of wind and rain answered her. With the last of her energy, she helped Peterson beneath the shelter of a massive fallen oak, its upturned roots creating a natural windbreak. Stay here, she instructed, stripping off her jacket to drape over his shivering form. I'm going to find the others. You can't go back down there, he protested weakly, gesturing toward the raging waters that now filled the lower forest. It's suicide. I'm not going down, she assured him, but they have to be somewhere on this ridge. The search took 20 minutes of battling wind and rain along the narrow ridgeline. She found Rebecca first huddled beneath a hastily constructed tarp shelter, her face a mask of relief when she spotted Ella. Thank God, she breathed. Where's Peterson? Safe about a quarter-mile back. Where's Dawson? Rebecca's expression clouded. We got separated. He went to scout the eastern edge of the ridge looking for better shelter. That was almost an hour ago. A cold that had nothing to do with the rain settled in Ella's stomach. The eastern edge is where the ridge narrows. If he misjudged in this weather, she didn't need to finish the thought. Rebecca was already gathering her gear. I'll get Peterson to better shelter. You find Dawson. The eastern end of the ridge proved to be exactly as treacherous as Ella had feared. The relatively flat plateau narrowed to a spine barely wide enough for single-file travel with steep drop-offs on either side. In the storm's fury, one misstep would be fatal. She called Dawson's name repeatedly as she inched along the narrowing ridge, her voice lost in the wind. Lightning flashed overhead, briefly illuminating the landscape in stark black and white. And in that instant, she saw him. Sergeant Michael Dawson, terror of Camp Lejeune, was clinging to a jutting rock face 20 feet below the ridge, his fingers white-knuckled around a narrow ledge that looked ready to crumble at any moment. His left leg hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken in the fall. Their eyes met in the brief illumination, and she saw naked fear in his gaze. Without hesitation, Ella dropped to her stomach at the edge of the ridge, assessing the situation with the calm detachment her father had drilled into her. The rock face was nearly vertical slick with rain. No way to climb down safely, and even if she could, Dawson's broken leg meant he couldn't climb up. Another solution, then. She shrugged off her belt, then pulled off her bootlaces, knotting them together to create a makeshift rope. Too short by half, but it would have to do. Securing one end around the sturdiest tree root she could find, she lowered the improvised lifeline toward Dawson. Grab it, she shouted when the end dangled near his position. He reached for it with one hand, nearly lost his grip, and jerked back to the safety of his ledge. It's too short, he called back, his voice ragged with pain and fear. Ella quickly scanned the area, looking for anything that could extend her rescue line. Nothing, just rain and rock and certain death below. A memory surfaced. Her father sitting at the kitchen table cleaning his service weapon as he told stories of Desert Storm. Sometimes, Ellie, you have to make the impossible choice. The one where all the options are bad, but one is slightly less bad than the others. Gritting her teeth, she removed her shirt, leaving her in just a soaked tank top. The cold hit her immediately, but she ignored it, focusing on tying her shirt to the end of her improvised rope. It added another 3 feet. Still not enough. Inspiration struck as she remembered the emergency procedures her father had drilled into her. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out the paracord bracelet she always wore. Another legacy from Marcus Reeves. Quickly unraveling it, she added its 15 feet of high-strength cord to her rescue line. This time when she lowered it, the end dangled just within Dawson's reach. "Grab it and tie it around yourself," she instructed. "Under your arms as tight as you can." He did as instructed, his movements hampered by pain and the precarious nature of his position. "Now what?" He called up, genuine uncertainty in his voice for the first time since she'd met him. "Now I pull you up." It was impossible, of course. He outweighed her by at least 60 pounds, and with his broken leg, he couldn't help by climbing. But impossible wasn't an option. Not again, not ever. Bracing herself against the tree root, Ella began to pull, muscles straining against the weight. Pain lanced through her left arm where the old burn scars stretched tight over working muscle. She ignored it, focusing on the steady rhythm of pull, secure, pull again. Inch by agonizing inch, Dawson rose up the rock, faced his broken leg, dragging uselessly against the stone. Sweat mingled with rain on Ella's face as she poured every ounce of strength into the task. When her arms began to fail, she wrapped the rope around her back, using her whole body as an anchor. Just as her strength neared its end, Dawson's fingers appeared at the ridge's edge, clawing for purchase on the slippery ground. With one final surge of effort, Ella heaved backward, and he tumbled over the edge, landing in an ungraceful heap beside her. For several minutes, neither spoke, both too exhausted to do more than lie in the rain, gulping air into burning lungs. Finally, Dawson turned his head to look at her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "Why?" he asked, the single word carrying a weight of confusion. Ella pushed herself to a sitting position, wincing at the protest from her overtaxed muscles. "Because it was the right thing to do," she answered simply, "and because my father would have done the same." Something shifted in Dawson's eyes, not quite respect, not yet, but a reassessment. "Your father," he repeated slowly, "the one who taught you to shoot. Who was he?" "Captain Marcus Reeves, 1st Force Recon Company. Served in Desert Storm in Somalia. He died 3 years ago." She helped Dawson into a sitting position, careful of his injured leg. "Heart attack during a training exercise with new recruits." Recognition flashed across Dawson's face. "Wait, Marcus Reeves, the ghost of Kafji, Marcus Reeves." The nickname was one she hadn't heard before. "I don't know about any ghost," she said carefully. "But yes, that Marcus Reeves." Dawson was staring at her now, really seeing her perhaps for the first time. "Your father was a legend. They said he could move through enemy territory like a ghost, that he once took out an entire Iraqi patrol single-handed during a sandstorm." He shook his head slowly. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because I'm not here to be Marcus Reeves' daughter," she replied, looking him straight in the eye. "I'm here to be Gabriella Reeves' Marine." Before Dawson could respond, a shout carried faintly over the storm. Rebecca and Peterson had found them bringing medical supplies and the welcome news that their emergency beacon had been activated. Extraction was inbound. As Rebecca worked to stabilize Dawson's broken leg, he caught Ella's eye. "The scars," he said quietly, nodding toward her face. "Not from combat, then." "House fire," she answered. "My brother was trapped inside. You went in after him." He guessed, comprehension dawning. "Just like tonight, running toward danger instead of away from it." She didn't confirm or deny, but something in her expression must have answered for her. "Reeves," Dawson said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of respect. "When we get back to base, I owe you a drink and an apology." She allowed herself a small smile. "I'll settle for the apology. Save the drink for when I outshoot you again." For the first time since they'd met, Michael Dawson laughed, a genuine sound without mockery. "Deal." As the rescue helicopter descended through the storm, its searchlight cutting through the darkness, Ella felt something shift inside her. Not acceptance, not yet, but a beginning. And in the distance, almost lost in the storm's fury, a deeper rumble echoed across the North Carolina sky. The sound of the past giving way grudgingly to the future. News traveled quickly through Camp Lejeune. By morning, the story of Private Reeves' rescue had spread through the ranks, growing more dramatic with each retelling. Some versions had her rappelling down a sheer cliff face in the middle of a hurricane. Others claimed she'd carried Dawson for miles through floodwaters. The truth was impressive enough, and within days, the whispers that followed Ella had changed their tenor. No longer mocking, they now carried notes of curiosity, speculation, and in some cases, cautious respect. More surprising was the shift in Sergeant Dawson himself. While not exactly friendly, he had become professionally courteous, going so far as to assign Ella leadership of their fire team during subsequent training exercises. "Don't let it go to your head, Reeves," he'd said gruffly when she questioned the assignment. "I'm just putting people where their skills are most useful." Coming from Dawson, it was practically a declaration of undying admiration. The final week of their initial training phase brought a new development, an unexpected inspection by senior leadership, including the legendary Colonel James Harrison, whose imminent retirement was the talk of the base. "Colonel Harrison served with your father, didn't he?" Rebecca asked as they prepared their barracks for inspection. Ella nodded carefully, checking the hospital corners of her bed. "In Desert Storm. They were in different units, but Dad mentioned him a few times. Said he was one of the good ones." "Well, he's coming tomorrow." Rebecca continued, polishing her boots to a mirror shine. "Word is he specifically requested to see our unit." A strange feeling settled in Ella's stomach. Not quite unease, but a sense of expectation. As if something long in motion was finally approaching its conclusion. That night, as she lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, she allowed herself to wonder what her father would think of her now. Would he be proud of her choice to follow in his footsteps? Or would he wish for something different? Something safer for his daughter? The questions had no answers, but asking them brought a certain comfort nonetheless. Like speaking to a ghost who never quite managed to leave. Tomorrow would bring Colonel Harrison, and with him, perhaps some echo of her father's world. But tonight was for remembering. The good and the bad, the fire and what came after. The scars that marked her journey from that burning house to this military bunk. Tomorrow would take care of itself. Colonel James Harrison's arrival at Camp Lejeune was heralded not by fanfare, but by a somber silence that fell over the base like a shroud. At 58, he cut an imposing figure, 6'3", with iron gray hair cropped close to his scalp and eyes that had witnessed more of war than most men could imagine. His dress blues bore the weight of decades of service, 3 rows of ribbons, each telling its own story of courage, under fire of battles won and comrades lost. The morning of his inspection dawned clear and crisp, a welcome respite from the storms that had battered the North Carolina coast. Ella stood at attention beside her bunk uniform, pressed to perfection, boots gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. 3 weeks into training, and already the barracks felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived since her father's death. "10 Hut," Sergeant Daniel's voice cracked through the air as Colonel Harrison entered, followed by Major William Foster, the battalion's executive officer. The silence deepened as Harrison moved slowly down the line of recruits, his gaze taking in every detail, missing nothing. He paused occasionally to ask a question or offer a terse comment. When he reached Dawson, his eyebrow lifted slightly. "Sergeant Dawson, I understand you had a close call during the wilderness exercise." "Yes, sir." Dawson's voice betrayed none of the pain he still felt from his healing leg. "Misjudged the terrain and poor visibility." Harrison's eyes flickered briefly to the cast on Dawson's leg. "And Private Reeves pulled you up a 20-foot rock face in the middle of a storm." "She did, sir." A hint of something like respect colored Dawson's tone. "Wouldn't be standing here otherwise." Harrison nodded once, then continued down the line. 2 recruits later, he stopped before Rebecca Miller, studying her face with quiet intensity. "Afghanistan Corpsman Miller." Rebecca blinked in surprise. "Yes, sir. 3 tours with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines." "Helmand Province," Harrison said. "Not a question." "Yes, sir." "Good work out there. We need more like you." He moved on before Rebecca could respond, leaving her with a puzzled expression that she quickly masked. And then he was standing before Ella, his weathered face unreadable as slate. For a long moment he said nothing, simply studied her features with an intensity that seemed to strip away layers. Ella maintained her position, eyes forward, expression neutral. But beneath her composed exterior, her heart hammered against her ribs like artillery fire. "Private Reeves," his voice was quieter now, almost gentle. "Your father was Captain Marcus Reeves." "Yes, sir." Harrison's gaze lingered on the scars that traced their way across her cheek. "He was a good man, one of the best I served with." Something in his tone caught Ella's attention, a hint of personal loss of memory edged with pain. Before she could process it, Harrison had moved on to the next recruit, the moment passing like a shadow across the sun. Major Foster, walking 2 steps behind Harrison, paused imperceptibly as he passed Ella, his eyes narrowing slightly. Unlike the colonel's open assessment, Foster's gaze held something darker, something that raised the hairs on the back of Ella's neck. The inspection continued without further incident, concluding with Harrison addressing the assembled recruits. You stand at the beginning of a journey that will demand everything you have, and then demand more, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the barracks. Some of you will rise to that challenge, some will not, but all of you will be changed by it. His eyes swept across the room, lingering briefly on Ella. Remember this, the true measure of a Marine is not found in moments of strength, but in how you respond when everything inside you wants to quit. Dismissed. As the officers departed, the barracks erupted into hushed conversations. Ella remained still, processing the encounter. Colonel Harrison had known her father, not just known of him, but known him personally. The realization settled like a weight on her shoulders, both burden and armor. What was that about? Rebecca appeared at her side, voice low. Harrison singled you out. Ella shook her head slightly. I'm not sure. My father served with him, apparently. Well, you made an impression. Rebecca's eyes tracked to where Major Foster stood speaking with Sergeant Daniels at the barracks entrance, his gaze occasionally drifting toward Ella, though I'm not sure it was entirely positive with everyone. Before Ella could respond, Sergeant Daniels called out, Reeves Foster wants to see you in his office. Now. The walk to Battalion HQ was short, but felt longer under the weight of curious stares. Major William Foster had a reputation as a demanding officer, a perfectionist who expected nothing less than excellence. At 45, he'd spent over 2 decades in the Corps, rising through the ranks with methodical precision. Unlike Harrison, whose legend stemmed from battlefield courage, Foster's reputation was built on administrative efficiency and strict adherence to protocol. His office reflected this, every surface immaculate, every item precisely placed. Foster himself sat behind a polished desk reviewing a file that Ella recognized immediately as her own personnel record. Private Reeves, sit. Ella complied, maintaining her military bearing as she took the offered chair. Impressive showing in the wilderness exercise, Foster began without preamble. According to Sergeant Dawson's report, you displayed exceptional resourcefulness under extreme conditions. Thank you, sir. Foster closed her file, leaning back slightly. Your father was quite the legend in certain circles. Desert Storm's Somalia classified operations that don't appear in any official record. His tone was carefully neutral. Big footsteps to follow. I'm trying to make my own path, sir. Are you? Foster's eyes narrowed slightly. Because from where I sit, it looks very much like you're walking directly in his shadow. The marksmanship scores the tactical decisions, even joining the same branch of service. Ella remained silent, unsure where this was leading. Let me be clear, Private. Nepotism has no place in my battalion. Your father's reputation won't earn you any special treatment. In fact, it places you under more scrutiny, not less. I'm not looking for special treatment, sir. Good. Foster's fingers drummed once on the desk. Because Colonel Harrison's interest in you has already raised questions. There are those who might suggest your assignment to this unit wasn't coincidental. The implication hung in the air between them. Ella felt a flush of anger, but kept it carefully contained. My assignment was processed through standard channels, sir. So the records indicate, Foster's tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. You're dismissed, Private. But remember, I'll be watching your progress very closely. Ella left the office with her back straight and her mind racing. Foster's hostility had been thinly veiled at best, but its source remained unclear. Was it simply resentment of her father's reputation? Or something deeper? Something personal? As she crossed the parade ground, the late afternoon sun cast her shadow long across the asphalt. Her father had once told her that the Corps was like any family, full of complicated relationships, old grudges, and unspoken histories. It seemed she'd stumbled into one such history without knowing the script. Back at the barracks, she found Rebecca, waiting, concern etched on her features. What did Foster want? Ella shrugged, keeping her voice low. To make it clear that being Marcus Reeves' daughter won't do me any favors. That's it? Rebecca raised an eyebrow skeptically. That was the official message. Ella glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. Unofficially, I think there's something else. Something about my father, maybe. Or about Harrison. Rebecca considered this. You know, there are rumors about Foster, that he was passed over for promotion multiple times despite his service record. Some say it's because of something that happened during Desert Storm. My father was in Desert Storm. Exactly, Rebecca's voice dropped even lower. And now here comes Harrison, who served with your father taking a special interest in you. Can't imagine Foster's thrilled about that. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, but the complete picture remained elusive. Before Ella could pursue the thread further, Sergeant Daniels entered the barracks. Listen up, people, tomorrow morning, Euro 500 full combat gear. We're running the hostage rescue simulator. Major Foster will be overseeing the exercise personally. A collective groan rose from the recruits, quickly silenced by Daniel's glare. This isn't a drill, Marines, it's an evaluation. Foster's looking to separate the wheat from the chaff. Don't be chaff. As Daniels departed, Dawson approached Ella, his expression uncharacteristically serious. Watch yourself tomorrow, Reeves. Foster's hostage scenarios are infamous. He designs them to break people. Thanks for the warning. Ella studied him, still adjusting to this new, almost collegial dynamic between them. Any specific advice? Yeah. Dawson's mouth twisted in a grim approximation of a smile. Don't trust anything you see or hear. And remember, Foster doesn't believe in no-win scenarios. There's always a solution, just rarely the obvious one. That night, Ella called Nathan from the base's phone center, needing to hear a friendly voice. Her brother answered on the third ring, the sounds of MIT's bustling campus life audible in the background. Ella, how's the glamorous life of a Marine treating you? Despite the weight of the day, she smiled at his enthusiasm. About as glamorous as you'd expect. A lot of running, shooting, and getting yelled at. So basically heaven for a Reeves. Something like that. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been haunting her since Harrison's visit. Nate, did Dad ever mention someone named James Harrison, a colonel he served with? The background noise on Nathan's end diminished as he apparently moved to a quieter location. Harrison, yeah, a few times. They were in Desert Storm together. I think they were in the same unit during some classified operation Dad could never talk about. Why? He's here at Lejeune. Singled me out during an inspection. Huh. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Dad always spoke highly of him. Said Harrison was the real deal, a leader who put his people first. What about William Foster, Major, now probably a captain when Dad knew him? This time the silence stretched longer. I don't remember Dad mentioning him specifically, but there was someone. Dad used to talk about an officer who made a bad call during an operation cost lives. He never named him, though, said it wasn't his story to tell. The pieces shifted again, rearranging themselves into new patterns, new possibilities. Before she could pursue it further, the warning tone sounded, indicating her time was almost up. I have to go, Nate. Big exercise tomorrow. Kick ass, sis, and Ella, Dad would be proud, really proud. The words followed her back to the barracks, a talisman against the doubts that Foster had tried to plant. Whatever game was being played here, she refused to be merely a pawn in it. Morning came too soon, the pre-dawn darkness thick with mist as the recruits assembled on the training field. The hostage rescue simulator was a purpose-built structure designed to mimic an urban environment, 3 stories of corridors, rooms, and stairwells arranged in deliberately confusing patterns. Major Foster stood before them, clipboard in hand, his face illuminated by harsh floodlights that cast deep shadows across his features. Today's exercise is simple in concept, complex in execution. He began, his voice carrying across the silent field. You will be divided into 4-person teams. Each team has the same mission: locate and extract a hostage from the simulator. You will be provided with training weapons loaded with simunition, non-lethal, but painful enough to ensure you take this seriously. His gaze swept across the assembled recruits, lingering briefly on Ella. The simulator is populated with role players acting as hostile forces. They will not hesitate to engage you. Your objective is to extract the hostage with minimal casualties, both friendly and hostile. Foster consulted his clipboard. Team Alpha, Miller, Peterson, Jackson, Martinez. Team Bravo, Reeves, Dawson, Chen, Rodriguez. Ella exchanged glances with Dawson, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. They'd worked well together since the wilderness exercise, developing a grudging mutual respect. Chen was a solid shooter with a level head, and Rodriguez had proven himself competent, if somewhat impulsive. As the teams collected their gear, Ella noticed Foster speaking quietly to one of the role players, a burly staff sergeant whose face was hidden beneath a balaclava. The man nodded several times, his posture suggesting tension or perhaps anticipation. I don't like this, Dawson muttered, as they checked their simunition-loaded M4s. Foster's got something up his sleeve. We follow protocol, Ella replied quietly. Clear rooms, methodically maintain communication, watch our corners. Yeah, that's the problem. Dawson chambered around with practiced efficiency. Foster doesn't want to see protocol. He wants to see how we handle the unexpected. The exercise began with Team Alpha entering the simulator, first disappearing into its maze-like interior. 20 minutes later, they emerged with their hostage, a role player wearing civilian clothes, but with Martinez and Peterson marked as casualties by bright blue simunition stains across their chest plates. Team Bravo, you're up, Foster announced, making a notation on his clipboard. Your hostage is on the third floor. Timer starts now. The interior of the simulator was deliberately disorienting. Dim lighting corridors that doubled back on themselves, doors that opened to reveal walls or drops to lower levels. They moved in standard formation, Dawson on point, Ella and Chen covering the flanks, Rodriguez watching their six. The first engagement came quickly, two hostiles emerging from side rooms in a coordinated ambush. Ella dropped to one knee, her training weapon finding its target with practiced precision. Beside her, Chen did the same. Both hostiles went down with blue stains blooming on their chest rigs. Clear, Dawson called quietly. Nice shooting, Reeves Chen. They proceeded cautiously, reaching the second floor without further incident. Too easy, Ella thought. Foster wouldn't make it this simple. As if in answer to her unspoken concern, the lights suddenly cut out, plunging them into total darkness. Emergency lights flickered on seconds later, casting an eerie red glow that transformed the corridor into something from a nightmare. Defensive positions, Ella called out, pressing her back against the wall. This isn't part of the standard exercise. Told you, Dawson muttered. Foster's playing games. From somewhere above came the sound of automatic fire simunition rounds, striking walls and floors in rapid succession. And then cutting through the chaos, a voice crying out in pain. That's the hostage, Rodriguez said, already moving toward the sound. Wait, Ella grabbed his arm. It could be a trap. But Rodriguez was already pulling away, his training momentarily forgotten in the face of apparent distress. Someone's hurt up there. We need to move. Before they could stop him, he was racing toward the stairwell that led to the third floor. Ella exchanged a quick glance with Dawson. I'll go after him, she said. You and Chen circle around, find another way up. We'll converge on the hostage position. Dawson hesitated only briefly. Watch yourself, Reeves. This whole thing stinks. Ella followed Rodriguez's path, moving more cautiously, her training weapon at the ready. The stairwell was narrow, each step taking her deeper into what increasingly felt like an elaborate trap. The cries had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence, broken only by the distant sound of simunition fire. She found Rodriguez at the top of the stairs, crouched behind a partially open door, his posture tense. Hostage is in there, he whispered as she joined him. Two guards, both armed. But something's off. The scenario's changed. Ella peered through the gap. The room beyond was large, likely designed to simulate a command center. In the center, a figure sat bound to a chair, head covered by a hood. Two role players stood guard, their training weapons pointed directly at the door. They're expecting us, she murmured. This isn't a rescue scenario anymore. It's an ambush. Rodriguez nodded grimly. So what's the play? Ella studied the room layout, noting the positions of the guards, the various entry points. We wait for Dawson and Chen. Create a distraction, hit them from multiple angles. But even as she spoke, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The hostage in the chair was struggling against their bonds, their movements becoming increasingly frantic. And beneath the hood, muffled sounds that seemed genuinely distressed, not acted. Something's wrong, she whispered. That's not part of the exercise. Before Rodriguez could respond, the door on the opposite side of the room burst open. Dawson and Chen rushed in, training weapons, raised shouting commands at the guards. The guards responded immediately, simunition rounds filling the air with their distinctive pop, pop, pop. Chen went down first, blue stains spreading across his chest. Dawson managed to tag one guard before taking a hit to the shoulder, technically a wounding shot that would limit his effectiveness. It was chaos, exactly the kind of scenario Foster would design to test their decision-making under pressure. But Ella's focus remained on the hooded figure whose struggles had intensified during the firefight. Cover me, she told Rodriguez, then broke from their position, staying low, using the room's sparse furniture for cover, as she worked her way toward the hostage. The remaining guard spotted her swinging his weapon in her direction. She rolled beneath a table as simunition rounds struck the floor where she'd been moments before. Coming up in a crouch, she fired twice, catching the guard center mass. With both guards neutralized, Ella reached the hostage, hands moving quickly to remove the hood. What she found beneath it stopped her cold. The hostage was Sergeant Williams, the range master. And he wasn't acting, the restraints were real, cutting into his wrists, and a rag had been stuffed into his mouth as a makeshift gag. "What the hell?" Rodriguez breathed as he joined her. Ella quickly removed the gag, her mind racing to make sense of the situation. "Sergeant Williams, what's happening? This isn't part of the exercise, is it?" Williams coughed as the gag came free, his voice raspy. "Foster changed the scenario at the last minute. Said he wanted to see how you'd handle a real hostage situation." He flexed his wrists as Ella worked on the restraints. "But this went beyond an exercise. Those aren't training staff, they're Foster's personal picks from another unit. They were told to ensure you failed by any means necessary." Dawson limped over, having heard Williams' explanation. Why would Foster sabotage the exercise?" Williams shook his head. "Don't know the full story, but I heard him talking with one of his cronies. Said something about proving a Reeves isn't untouchable." The final restraint came free, and Williams stood, rubbing circulation back into his wrists. "Foster's got some kind of history with your father, Reeves, old grudge that's never healed." The pieces clicked into place. Foster's hostility, his pointed comments about her father, the impossible scenario designed to ensure her failure. This wasn't about evaluating her as a Marine, it was personal. "We need to report this," Rodriguez said. "This goes against every training protocol." "And say what?" Dawson countered. "That a major created an unfair exercise, that's his prerogative. Without proof of malicious intent, it's our word against his." Ella's mind worked through the implications rapidly. If she raised accusations against Foster, it would look like she was making excuse for failing the exercise. If she said nothing, he would continue targeting her, possibly escalating his tactics. "We complete the exercise," she decided finally. "Extract the hostage according to protocol. Document everything once we're out. Williams is our witness." They proceeded with the extraction, moving with renewed caution through the simulator's confusing layout. Foster was waiting at the exit, his expression darkening as he saw Williams walking under his own power rather than being carried out as an incapacitated hostage. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded as they emerged into the morning light. Sergeant Williams was supposed to be non-ambulatory. "Change of plans, sir," Ella replied, meeting his gaze steadily. The scenario evolved. Foster's eyes narrowed dangerously. "The scenario is what I say it is, private." "With respect, sir," Williams interjected. "The scenario crossed a line from training to something else. Those restraints were real, the gag was real, and your role players had instructions that went beyond the parameters of a training exercise." A muscle twitched in Foster's jaw. "You're out of line, Sergeant." "No, sir, I believe you are." Williams' voice remained level, but there was steel beneath it. "Colonel Harrison will receive my full report on this incident." At the mention of Harrison's name, Foster's expression shifted from anger to something colder, more calculated. "The colonel has more important matters to attend to than training exercises, Sergeant." "I disagree, sir." Williams stood his ground, particularly when those exercises appear designed to target specific personnel for reasons unrelated to their performance. The standoff lasted several seconds, neither man willing to back down. Finally, Foster turned to Ella, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "This isn't over, Reeves, not by a long shot. Your father couldn't follow orders either. Always thought he knew better, and people died because of it." Before Ella could respond, Foster turned on his heel and strode away, leaving her with questions burning in her mind. What had happened between Foster and her father? What orders hadn't Marcus Reeves followed, and what did it have to do with people dying? Later that day, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Ella found herself drawn to the base chapel. Not for religious reasons, the Reeves family had never been particularly devout, but for the solitude it offered, a rare commodity on a busy military installation. The chapel was empty, save for an elderly chaplain arranging hymnals in the front pew. He nodded to Ella as she entered, but didn't intrude on her privacy, returning to his task with quiet efficiency. She sat in the last row, letting the silence wash over her. The events of the day had left her with more questions than answers, in a growing sense that she'd stumbled into something far more complex than simple military training. "Your father used to come here, too." The voice startled her. Colonel Harrison stood in the doorway, his imposing frame silhouetted against the fading daylight. He moved to join her, sitting with the careful movements of a man whose body had endured more than its share of hardship. "Not for the religion," Harrison continued. "Marcus wasn't much for organized faith, but for the quiet, said it helped him think." Ella studied him, noting the deep lines around his eyes, the way his hands, scarred and weathered, rested with deceptive casualness on his knees. "You knew him well," she said. "Not a question." "Better than most." Harrison's gaze seemed focused on something distant, something only he could see. "We served together in Desert Storm in Somalia, and in operations that don't appear in any official record. He turned slightly to face her. I understand you had an interesting experience in Foster's training exercise this morning. Yes, sir. Ella hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. It seemed unusually challenging. Harrison's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile under different circumstances. Williams told me what happened. All of it. Sir, I don't understand. What does Major Foster have against my father, against me? The colonel was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. There was an operation during Desert Storm. Officially, it never happened. A small unit, your father, myself, Foster, and 5 others, sent deep behind enemy lines to extract high-value intelligence assets. He paused, the memory clearly painful even after all these years. Things went sideways. The intelligence was wrong. The extraction point was compromised, and we found ourselves surrounded by Republican Guard units with no clear path to safety. Ella listened intently, hearing for the first time details of an operation her father had never discussed. Foster was the officer in charge, Harrison continued. When the situation deteriorated, he panicked. Wanted to abort, leave the assets behind. Your father disagreed, strongly, said we didn't leave people behind, not ever. The chapel's silence seemed to deepen around them as Harrison spoke. Marcus took initiative, created a diversion that allowed us to extract the assets and most of our team. But 2 men didn't make it out, caught in the same explosion that was supposed to cover our escape. And Foster blamed my father, Ella concluded quietly. Harrison nodded. In his mind, if Marcus had followed orders, those men would still be alive. He refuses to acknowledge that if we'd done things his way, we'd all be dead along with the assets we were sent to rescue. But that doesn't explain why he's targeting me now after all these years. Doesn't it? Harrison's eyes, when they met hers, held a mixture of compassion and steel. You're the living embodiment of the man Foster believes ruined his career. After Desert Storm, your father received commendations that Foster thought should have been his. Promotions that Foster believed were rightfully his were given to others, men and women, who'd proven themselves in combat the way Marcus had. He sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of decades. And now here you are, Marcus Reeves' daughter, showing the same initiative, the same courage, the same willingness to put others before yourself. For a man like Foster, who spent 30 years nursing his grievances, you're a reminder of everything he's tried to forget. Ella absorbed this, the pieces finally falling into a pattern that made sense. So what happens now? Now, Harrison stood straightening his uniform with practiced precision. Now you continue your training. You become the best Marine you can be. Not because you're Marcus Reeves' daughter, but because you're Gabriella Reeves, and that's what you were born to do. He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at her. As for Foster, leave him to me. His time at Lejeune is coming to an end, whether he knows it yet or not. With that, he was gone, leaving Ella alone with the echoes of a past she'd never fully known and the shadow of a father whose legacy was more complicated than she'd realized. As she finally left the chapel, the evening air cool against her skin, Ella felt the weight of the day's revelations settling on her shoulders. Her father had been a hero, yes, but a complex one, a man who'd made difficult choices, who'd put what was right above what was ordered, who'd lived with the consequences of those choices until his death. And now it seemed some of those consequences had found their way to her. The barracks were quiet when she returned, most of her fellow recruits having gone to the mess hall for dinner. But Rebecca waited, sitting on her bunk with an expression of concern. Heard about what happened in the simulator? She said without preamble. Dawson told me. Foster really has it out for you. Ella sat heavily on her own bunk, the events of the day catching up with her all at once. It's not about me. Not really. It's about my father. Briefly, she related what Harrison had told her, watching understanding dawn on Rebecca's face. That explains a lot, Rebecca said when she'd finished. But it doesn't excuse what Foster did today. That crossed a line from training to personal vendetta. Harrison says he'll handle it. Rebecca considered this. Harrison's got pull, that's for sure. But Foster's been here a long time, built up his own network of supporters. This could get ugly before it's resolved. I know. Ella leaned back against the wall, feeling the cool concrete through her uniform shirt. But I can't back down now, I won't. Never thought you would. Rebecca's smile was brief but genuine. Just watch your back. Men like Foster don't take defeat gracefully. As if on cue, the barracks door swung open and Sergeant Daniels entered, his expression grim. Reeves Miller, gear up. Water survival training in 20 minutes. Rebecca frowned. That's not on the schedule for today. Schedule's changed, Daniels replied flatly. Major Foster's orders. After he'd gone, Rebecca turned to Ella, concern evident in her eyes. Water training at night, that's not standard protocol. No, Ella agreed, already reaching for her gear. It's not. But as she prepared for whatever Foster had planned next, a small part of her couldn't help but wonder, what would her father have done in her position? Would he have played it safe, followed protocol, kept his head down? Or would he have done exactly what she was doing, facing the challenge head-on, regardless of the personal cost? The answer, she suspected, was in the very fact that Foster still harbored such resentment after all these years. Marcus Reeves had never been one to back down when he believed he was right. For better or worse, his daughter had inherited that same stubborn determination. As she laced up her boots, Ella caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. The scars on her face turned silver in the moonlight, a permanent reminder of another fire she'd walked into willingly, another time she'd refused to take the easy path. Whatever Foster had planned for the water training, she would face it. Not because she had something to prove, but because backing down simply wasn't an option, not for a Reeves. Outside, the night air carried the scent of salt from the distant ocean. Somewhere in that darkness, Foster waited with his next test, his next attempt to break her. But Ella Reeves had been forged in fire long before she ever put on a uniform. Some tests weren't meant to be passed or failed. They were simply meant to reveal who you truly were when everything was on the line. And that, Ella decided as she stepped out into the waiting night, was something Foster was about to learn the hard way. The training pool loomed before them like a black mirror under the night sky, its surface disturbed only by the gentle ripple of the filtration system. Floodlights positioned at each corner cast harsh white light across the water, creating deep shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. In the distance, thunder rumbled a coming storm that matched the tension in the air. Ella stood at the edge, her reflection fractured in the water below. Beside her, Rebecca and 15 other recruits waited in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what Foster had planned for them. Night water training wasn't unheard of, but it wasn't standard procedure either, especially not called suddenly outside the normal training schedule. "Attention!" Sergeant Daniel's voice cut through the night. The recruits snapped to position as Major Foster emerged from the shadows, his face carved in stone eyes reflecting the harsh floodlights. "Tonight's exercise is simple," Foster began, his voice carrying across the pool deck. "Water survival under stress conditions. You'll enter the water fully clothed, swim to the far end, and back, then tread water for 20 minutes. Anyone who fails to complete the exercise will be recycled to the beginning of the training cycle." His gaze settled on Ella, a cold calculation in his eyes. "Some of you may be wondering why we're conducting this training now rather than during daylight hours. The answer is equally simple. The enemy doesn't wait for convenient timing. Combat doesn't pause for daylight. You must be ready to perform under any conditions at any time." A reasonable explanation, Ella thought. But the way Foster watched her told a different story. This wasn't about training, it was about her specifically, about pushing her to her breaking point. "Any questions?" Foster looked around, his expression daring someone to speak up. Silence. "Good. Enter the water on my mark." The recruits lined up along the edge of the pool. Ella positioned herself between Rebecca and a nervous-looking private named Jenkins. Her mind worked quickly, assessing the situation. The swim itself wouldn't be difficult. She'd been a strong swimmer since childhood. The treading water afterward would be more challenging in full uniform, but still well within her capabilities. So what was Foster's angle? What trap had he laid that she wasn't seeing? Begin. 16 bodies hit the water simultaneously, creating a momentary chaos of splashing and churning foam. Ella dove, cleanly surfacing with practiced efficiency into a strong freestyle stroke. The weight of her uniform created drag, but she compensated, maintaining a steady pace as she cut through the dark water. Halfway across the pool, she sensed rather than saw that something was wrong. The other swimmers were falling behind their strokes, becoming erratic. Beside her, Jenkins was struggling, his movements increasingly desperate. When she glanced back, she saw Rebecca helping another recruit who appeared to be in distress. Something was definitely wrong. These were trained Marines, all of whom had passed basic water survival. They shouldn't be struggling this badly. As she reached the far wall, Ella felt a sudden cramping in her calf, pain lancing up her leg. She gripped the edge of the pool, forcing herself to breathe evenly as she massaged the muscle. This wasn't normal fatigue. This was something else. Her eyes met Rebecca's across the churning water. The former medic mouthed a single word: hypothermia. The water was far colder than standard training temperature, cold enough to induce cramping and eventually hypothermia. No wonder the others were struggling. Foster had deliberately lowered the pool temperature, creating conditions designed to push them beyond their limits. Continue the exercise, Foster's voice rang out from the deck. Return to the starting point and commence treading water. Ella pushed off from the wall, fighting through the pain in her calf as she started back. Around her, the other recruits were clearly suffering. Two had already been pulled from the pool, shivering violently as Sergeant Daniels wrapped thermal blankets around their shoulders. This isn't training, she thought grimly. This is punishment. And not just for her, for everyone associated with her. She reached the starting point and transitioned to treading water, conserving energy by using a modified egg beater kick that put less strain on her cramping calf. Rebecca arrived moments later, her normally tan face now pale with cold. Water's at least 20 degrees below regulation, Rebecca muttered, her teeth chattering slightly. This isn't safe. Foster doesn't care about safe, Ella replied quietly. He cares about proving a point. On the deck above them, Foster paced slowly, watching the struggling recruits with clinical detachment. 15 more minutes, he announced. Anyone who touches the side or bottom is automatically recycled. The minutes stretched interminably. One by one, recruits were forced to abandon the exercise, their bodies simply unable to withstand the punishing cold. Soon only 6 remained in the water, Ella, Rebecca, Dawson, and 3 others whose stubborn determination kept them going despite their suffering. Ella's entire body had gone numb, her movements becoming mechanical as she fought to keep her head above water. The scars on her face and arm burned with a strange fire that damaged tissue more sensitive to the extreme cold. But still she continued, refusing to give Foster the satisfaction of seeing her fail. 12 minutes, 10, 8. Rebecca's lips had turned blue, her movements becoming increasingly sluggish. I can't, she whispered, barely audible over the sound of splashing water. I can't feel my legs. Yes, you can, Ella urged, moving closer to her friend. Focus on my voice. Count with me. 1, 2, 3. Together, they counted each number, a small victory against the cold, against Foster, against their own body's desperate desire to surrender. Dawson joined them, forming a small circle of shared determination. 5 minutes remaining, Foster called out, his voice betraying no emotion. It was then that Ella noticed a figure approaching Foster from behind, tall, imposing, moving with purposeful strides across the pool deck. Colonel Harrison's face was a thundercloud as he took in the scene before him. Beside him walked a medical officer whose expression shifted from confusion to alarm as he saw the condition of the recruits in the water. What the hell is going on here, Major? Harrison's voice cut through the night like a rifle shot. Foster turned, surprise quickly masked by military bearing. Night water survival training, sir. Standard procedure. At 50 degrees, the medical officer moved to the pool's edge, kneeling to test the water temperature with a thermometer he'd pulled from his pocket. This water is dangerously cold for extended exposure. These Marines are at serious risk of hypothermia. Harrison's gaze swept across the pool, noting the shivering recruits on the deck and the few still struggling in the water. When his eyes found Ella, something shifted in his expression, a mixture of concern and grim determination. End this. Now, each word fell like a hammer blow. Foster hesitated, his jaw tightening. With respect, sir, we have 5 minutes remaining in the exercise. These recruits, that wasn't a suggestion, Major. Harrison's voice dropped lower, carrying an unmistakable threat. End it now or I'll have you relieved of command on the spot. For a moment, the 2 officers locked eyes in a silent battle of wills. Then Foster's gaze flickered away. Exercise terminated, he called out. All recruits exit the water immediately. Relief swept through the remaining swimmers as they made their way to the ladder. Ella helped Rebecca, supporting her friend as they climbed out onto the deck. Medical personnel swarmed forward with thermal blankets and hot beverages, quickly assessing each recruit for signs of severe hypothermia. Through the chaos, Ella watched as Harrison drew Foster aside, their conversation too quiet to overhear, but the tension between them visible in every line of their bodies. Foster's face had gone rigid, his posture defensive, while Harrison leaned in, speaking with a controlled intensity. The medical officer who had accompanied Harrison approached Ella, wrapping a thermal blanket around her shoulders. You're Marcus Reeves' daughter, he said, not a question, but a statement of fact. Ella nodded, still shivering, too hard to speak clearly. Your father pulled me out of a burning Humvee outside Kafji, the officer continued, checking her pulse as he spoke. Never even told me his name. Just did what needed doing, then disappeared back into the chaos. He smiled briefly. Took me years to find out who he was to thank him properly. He finished his examination apparently satisfied that she wasn't in immediate danger. "You have his eyes," he said, simply then moved on to check the next recruit. Across the deck, the conversation between Harrison and Foster had concluded. Foster stalked away, his back rigid with barely contained fury. Harrison watched him go, then turned his attention to the recovering recruits, speaking briefly with the medical personnel before approaching Ella. "Private Reeves," he greeted her, his voice carrying a warmth that belied his imposing presence. "Walk with me if you're able." Still wrapped in the thermal blanket, Ella fell into step beside him as they moved away from the pool toward the administration building. For several minutes, neither spoke, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of thunder as the storm moved closer. "Major Foster has been relieved of his training duties," Harrison said finally, "pending a formal investigation into tonight's incident and other irregularities in his command decisions." Ella absorbed this information, careful to keep her expression neutral. "Thank you for your intervention, sir." Harrison glanced at her, something like amusement briefly touching his weathered features. "I didn't do it for you, Private. I did it because what I witnessed tonight violated every principle of leadership I believe in. Using training as a weapon against your own people isn't just bad command, it's a betrayal of everything the Corps stands for." They reached the administration building, stepping into the quiet lobby. At this late hour, it was deserted, save for a duty officer who nodded respectfully to Harrison before returning to his paperwork. "There's something you should know," Harrison continued, his voice lower now. "Something about your father, about Desert Storm, about what really happened between him and Foster." Ella's heart rate quickened despite her exhaustion. "Sir," Harrison gestured toward his office. "Come with me. It's time you heard the full story." The office was spartanly furnished, a desk, 3 chairs, filing cabinets, and a single bookshelf holding military manuals and histories. The only personal touches were a framed photograph of a younger Harrison with his family and a shadow box containing medals and insignia from his long career. Harrison closed the door, then moved to a small safe concealed behind a wall panel. From it, he withdrew a manila folder stamped with classified in faded red ink. The date on the folder read, January 18th, 1991, the height of Desert Storm. "What I'm about to share with you isn't in any official record." Harrison began placing the folder on his desk, but not yet opening it. "The operation was classified at the highest levels, and most of those involved took their knowledge to their graves." He sat heavily in his chair, gesturing for Ella to take the seat opposite. "Operation Desert Serpent, a deep penetration mission behind enemy lines to extract 3 intelligence assets with critical information about Iraqi chemical weapons programs." Harrison opened the folder, revealing grainy black and white photographs, hand-drawn maps, and typewritten mission parameters. The team consisted of 8 operators, your father, myself, Foster, and 5 others. Foster was technically in command, but it was your father who had planned the infiltration route. He laid out several photos, men in desert camouflage, faces streaked with grime and determination. Ella recognized her father, immediately younger without the silver in his hair, that she remembered, but unmistakably Marcus Reeves. "The intelligence was solid, the plan was sound, but war has a way of rendering even the best preparations meaningless," Harrison continued. "We encountered heavy resistance at the extraction point. The assets were secured, but our exit route was compromised." His finger tapped on a topographical map showing a mountain pass. "Foster panicked, ordered us to abort to leave the assets behind, said the mission was compromised, that we needed to save ourselves." Harrison's eyes grew distant, seeing not the office around them, but the desert of 3 decades past. "Your father refused, said we hadn't come all this way to abandon the mission at the first sign of trouble. He proposed an alternative, a diversionary explosion at a nearby fuel depot that would draw enemy forces away from our actual extraction route. Foster opposed this vehemently, said it was too risky, that Marcus was exceeding his authority." Harrison's mouth twisted in a grim smile. "He was right about that last part, at least. Your father had no authority to countermand Foster's orders, but he did it anyway." Harrison pulled another document from the folder, an after-action report filled with redactions. "Marcus took 2 men volunteers and executed the diversion. It worked. The explosion drew enemy forces away, allowing me to extract the assets and the remaining team members." His voice grew heavier. "But your father and one of his volunteers never made it to the rendezvous point. The explosion was larger than anticipated, caught them in the blast radius. We searched as long as we could, but eventually had to complete the extraction without them." Ella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the pool's cold water. "But my father survived. He came home." Yes, Harrison nodded slowly. 3 days later, he walked into an American checkpoint 50 miles from where we'd left him, carrying his wounded teammate on a makeshift stretcher. Both were dehydrated, exhausted, wounded, but alive. He closed the folder, his hands resting on it as if it contained something precious. The intelligence those assets provided prevented the deployment of chemical weapons that would have killed thousands of coalition forces. Your father's actions, while technically insubordinate, saved countless lives. And Foster? Ella asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Foster received an official reprimand for losing control of the mission. His career stalled. The commendations and promotions he'd expected went instead to others, including your father, who received the Silver Star for his actions, though the citation mentioned only extraordinary heroism in combat without specifics. Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying her. Foster has spent 30 years believing your father stole his glory, ruined his career. The truth is simpler and harder to accept when faced with a critical decision. Foster chose the wrong path. He's never forgiven your father for being right or himself for being wrong. The weight of this revelation settled over Ella like a physical presence. Her father, the quiet, disciplined man who'd raised her with stories of duty and honor, but seldom spoken of his own experiences, had been both hero and rebel, following his conscience even when it meant defying orders. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked finally. Harrison stood, moving to the window that overlooked the darkened parade ground. Outside, lightning flashed briefly, illuminating his reflection in the glass. "Because Foster's vendetta didn't end with your father's death. It's transferred to you, the living embodiment of the man he believes wronged him. Tonight's training exercise was just the latest attempt to break you, to prove that a Reeves can be defeated." He turned back to face her. "And because you deserve to know the truth about your father, not just the official record, but the reality of who he was and the choices he made." "Thank you, sir." The words felt inadequate against the magnitude of what she'd learned. Harrison nodded once, acknowledging what remained unspoken between them. "Get some rest, Private. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." As Ella left the administration building, the storm finally broke overhead, rain cascading down in sheets that mirrored the turmoil in her mind. The truth about her father, about the man he'd truly been, the choices he'd made, both clarified and complicated her understanding of her own path. She made her way back to the barracks through the downpour, barely noticing the cold rain after the ordeal in the pool. The building was quiet when she entered, most of the recruits already asleep after the exhausting night. Rebecca sat on her bunk, still wrapped in a thermal blanket, her eyes questioning as Ella approached. "Harrison told me everything," Ella said quietly, sitting beside her friend. "About my father, about Foster, about what happened in Desert Storm. And now I understand." She looked down at her hands, seeing for the first time how much they resembled her father's, strong, capable, marked by small scars that told stories of work and sacrifice. "Foster blames my father for ruining his career. Tonight wasn't about training, it was about revenge." Rebecca nodded slowly. "That tracks with what Sergeant Williams told me while they were checking us for hypothermia. Said Foster's been obsessed with your father for years. When you showed up at Lejeune, it triggered something in him like seeing a ghost." "What happens now?" "Now," Rebecca managed a tired smile. "Now we sleep. Tomorrow we train. The day after that too. Foster's gone, at least temporarily, but the core remains. Our duties remain. Simple wisdom, but true. Whatever personal drama might swirl around her, Ella's path remained clear: to become the best Marine she could be, to honor not just her father's memory, but the principles he'd lived by. Sleep came quickly that night, her exhausted body demanding rest despite the tumult in her mind. She dreamed of desert sand and mountain passes, of explosions lighting the night sky, of her father walking through a hostile wilderness, carrying a wounded comrade. Dreams that were memories not her own, yet somehow part of her inheritance. Morning arrived with the harsh clarity that follows a storm. The sky was washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Ella rose before the others, completing her morning routine with the disciplined efficiency that had become second nature. As she stepped outside to watch the sunrise, she found Sergeant Dawson already there, his gaze fixed on the eastern horizon where gold and pink painted the retreating storm clouds. "Heard about what happened with Harrison and Foster," he said without preamble, not looking at her. "Word travels fast around here." "So I've noticed. Foster's been reassigned effective immediately, pending investigation, but everyone knows he's finished at Lejeune." Dawson's tone was neutral, offering neither approval nor condemnation. Harrison's taking direct oversight of our training unit until a replacement can be appointed. Ella absorbed this information in silence. Foster's removal should have felt like a victory, but instead brought a hollow sense of completion, the closing of a chapter that had begun long before she'd ever put on a uniform. Your father, Dawson said after a pause. He was the real deal, wasn't he? Not just the official record, but the man himself. I'm beginning to think so, Ella replied honestly, though maybe not in the ways I always believed. Dawson nodded, understanding more than she'd said. That's usually how it goes. The truth is always more complicated than the legend, but sometimes no less impressive. They stood together, watching as the sun cleared the horizon, painting the wet world in golden light. No more words were needed. A silent acknowledgement had passed between them, the kind of unspoken understanding that forms the foundation of true respect. The day's training proceeded with a notably different atmosphere. Without Foster's oppressive presence, the recruits moved with greater confidence, their efforts focused on mastery rather than mere survival. Harrison observed occasionally, his quiet attention more motivating than Foster's harsh criticism had ever been. It was late afternoon when the summons came. Sergeant Daniels approached Ella during a brief break in rifle maintenance. Colonel Harrison wants to see you, he said, his usual gruffness tempered by something like curiosity. Full uniform, his office, 30 minutes. Speculation ran rampant among the recruits as Ella prepared herself, checking every detail of her uniform with meticulous care. Rebecca helped her adjust her collar, smoothing invisible wrinkles with practiced hands. Whatever it is, she said quietly, you've earned it, remember that. The walk to the administration building felt longer than it had the previous night. Each step carried Ella closer to something she couldn't quite define, not an ending exactly, but a transition point, a moment when one reality gave way to another. Harrison was waiting in his office, standing by the window in full dress uniform, medals gleaming on his chest in the late afternoon light. But it wasn't this unusual formality that caught Ella's attention. It was the presence of Sergeant Major Thomas, the base's highest-ranking, non-commissioned officer, and a civilian woman Ella didn't recognize, elegantly dressed in a Navy suit. Private Reeves reporting as ordered, sir, Ella announced, standing at attention in the doorway. Enter and stand at ease, Private. Harrison's voice was formal but carried an undercurrent of something warmer. There's someone I'd like you to meet. He gestured to the civilian woman who stepped forward with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. This is Congresswoman Elaine Wintershouse, Armed Services Committee. She's here on official business that concerns you directly. Ella maintained her composure, though questions raced through her mind. Why would a member of Congress have business with a private in basic training? Ms. Reeves, the Congresswoman, began, her voice carrying the polished cadence of a career politician, but with genuine warmth beneath it. It's an honor to meet you. I knew your father many years ago. Another connection to her father, it seemed. Marcus Reeves' shadow stretched further than Ella had ever imagined. Congresswoman Winters was instrumental in a recent review of classified operations from Desert Storm, Harrison explained, part of a broader effort to recognize service members whose contributions remained unacknowledged due to the classified nature of their missions. The Congresswoman nodded, opening a leather portfolio she carried. One of those reviews concerned Operation Desert Serpent, specifically the actions of Captain Marcus Reeves in January of 1991. She withdrew a small blue box from the portfolio, holding it with evident reverence. After thorough examination of the available evidence and testimony from surviving participants, the review board made a unanimous recommendation, which has been approved at the highest levels. Harrison stepped forward, taking the box from the Congresswoman and turning to face Ella directly. Private Reeves, it is my solemn honor to inform you that your father, Captain Marcus Reeves, has been posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action against enemy forces during Operation Desert Serpent. The words seemed to echo in the suddenly too small office. The Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, an acknowledgement of valor so rare and significant that its mere mention commanded immediate respect throughout the military. The citation notes his decisive action in the face of overwhelming odds, his refusal to abandon mission-critical personnel, and his subsequent 50-mile journey through enemy territory while carrying a wounded comrade. Harrison continued, his voice thick with emotion he made no attempt to conceal. Actions that exemplify the highest traditions of the United States Marine Corps. He opened the blue box, revealing the medal nestled on dark velvet, a bronze cross suspended from a blue ribbon with a central white stripe. Simple in design, profound in meaning. As his next of kin, this belongs to you, Harrison said, extending the open box toward Ella. along with the nation's deepest gratitude for his service and sacrifice. Ella stared at the medal, her vision blurring slightly. Her father had never sought recognition, had rarely spoken of his service beyond the most general terms. Yet here was tangible proof that others had seen and valued what he'd done, that his choices, difficult, controversial, but ultimately right, had not gone unnoticed. With hands that remained steady through sheer force of will, she accepted the box. "Thank you, sir, Congresswoman. This would have meant a great deal to him." "There's more," Harrison said, nodding to Sergeant Major Thomas, who stepped forward with a document folder. The review of Operation Desert Serpent revealed significant command failures on the part of then-Captain William Foster. His recent actions regarding your training have prompted a broader investigation into his conduct over the years. The Sergeant Major handed the folder to Harrison, who opened it briefly before continuing. That investigation has uncovered a pattern of behavior that reflects poorly on Foster's judgment and leadership. Effective immediately, he has been removed from active duty pending administrative separation proceedings. In military terms, it was the equivalent of being fired, a career-ending move that would forever tarnish Foster's record. The 30-year vendetta had finally reached its conclusion, not through any action of Ella's, but through Foster's own inability to move beyond the past. "I take no pleasure in this outcome," Harrison said, correctly reading Ella's troubled expression. "A good Marine has lost his way, and that is always a tragedy. But the Corps must maintain its standards, particularly among those entrusted with shaping the next generation of Marines." The Congresswoman stepped forward again. "There's one final matter, Ms. Reeves. Your father's reclassified service record, including details of Operation Desert Serpent, will be made available to you. I believe you'll find it answers many questions about the man he was and the choices he made." The meeting concluded shortly thereafter, formalities giving way to brief personal exchanges. The Congresswoman shared a quick story about meeting Marcus Reeves during a congressional delegation to the Middle East. Harrison mentioned plans for a small ceremony to formally recognize the posthumous award once Ella's training cycle was complete. Through it all, Ella maintained her military bearing, responding appropriately while processing the seismic shift in her understanding of her father and his legacy. It was only after the others had departed, leaving her alone with Harrison for a final moment, that she allowed herself to ask the question that had been forming since the previous night. "Sir, you knew what kind of man my father was all along. You could have told me from the beginning, could have protected me from Foster's vendetta. Why didn't you?" Harrison considered her question with the gravity it deserved, taking a moment before responding. "Because Marcus wouldn't have wanted me to." He moved to the window, gesturing for her to join him. Outside, recruits marched across the parade ground, moving in disciplined formation under the late afternoon sun. "Your father believed that we become who we are through the challenges we face, not the ones we avoid," Harrison continued. "He wouldn't have wanted me to clear your path or fight your battles. He would have wanted you to find your own way, make your own choices, even when those choices were difficult." He turned to face her fully. "I watched you these past weeks, saw how you handled Foster's persecution, how you maintained your integrity, how you put others before yourself, even when it cost you. I saw Marcus in you, not just in your features or your marksmanship, but in the choices you made when tested." Harrison's weathered face softened slightly. "I think he would be proud of who you've become. Not because you followed his path, but because you found your own way to the same principles he valued." Later that evening, as the base settled into its nighttime routine, Ella sat alone on a bench overlooking the parade ground. The blue box rested in her hands, the metal inside catching the light from nearby lampposts. She traced the outline of the cross with her finger, feeling the weight of its significance. Footsteps approached Dawson, Rebecca, and several other recruits from their unit, moving with purpose, but without haste. They formed a semicircle around her bench, their presence a silent affirmation of something that had been building for weeks. "We heard," Dawson said simply, "about your father, about the Navy Cross." Ella nodded, uncertain what response was expected or appropriate. "We wanted you to know," Rebecca added, "that it changes nothing about how we see you." "And everything," Dawson amended with unusual gentleness, "because now we understand where you come from, what drives you." One by one, the gathered Marines offered brief words of respect, not for her father's decoration, but for what they had seen in Ella herself over the weeks of shared struggle. When they finally departed, leaving her alone with her thoughts, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her since her arrival at Lejeune. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, a text from Nathan responding to the news she'd shared earlier. "Dad would be so proud, not because of the medal, but because of you. because you're carrying forward what really mattered to him, not awards or recognition, but doing the right thing even when it's the hard thing. Love you, sis. Can't wait to hear the whole story when you get home. Home. The word carried different resonances now. Home was the house where she'd grown up. Yes, but it was also here among people who understood duty and sacrifice, who recognized the cost of certain choices and made them anyway. Her father had found his home in the Corps, and perhaps she had as well. As night fell fully over Camp Lejeune, Ella made her way back to the barracks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her abilities and character. Foster was gone, but the path ahead remained demanding, perhaps even more so now that she carried not just her own aspirations, but a clearer understanding of her father's legacy. In the quiet darkness of the barracks, she paused before the small mirror mounted inside her locker. The scars on her face caught the dim light, silvery traces of that long-ago fire of the choice she'd made to run toward danger rather than away from it. Her father's daughter indeed, not because she followed his path, but because she understood why that path mattered. She touched the scars gently, seeing them not as disfigurements, but as markers of a journey. Her journey unique yet connected to her father's in ways she was only beginning to understand. Physical reminders that sometimes the most important choices leave their mark on us, visible for all to see. The next morning, as she stood in formation under the rising sun, Colonel Harrison addressed the assembled recruits. His words were brief but carried the weight of experience and conviction. The true test of a Marine isn't found in perfect conditions, he told them, his voice carrying across the silent parade ground. It's found in moments of uncertainty, of fear. In those moments, training matters. Discipline matters. But what matters most is the person you've chosen to be, the values you hold, the promises you keep, the lines you refuse to cross. His gaze swept across their ranks, pausing briefly on Ella before continuing. Remember that in the days and years ahead. And remember that the scars you carry, visible or invisible, are not defects to be hidden, but testaments to the paths you've walked and the choices you've made. As the formation dispersed and the day's training began, Ella felt a sense of alignment she had never experienced before, as if separate parts of herself had finally found their proper configuration. She was Gabriella Reeves' daughter of Marcus, bearer of scars, both physical and emotional. But she was also something entirely her own, a Marine finding her way forward, carrying the lessons of the past without being defined by them. The sun climbed higher, casting her shadow long across the training field, a shadow that was uniquely hers, yet somehow echoed another that had walked these grounds decades before. Not identical, but aligned in the ways that mattered most. And in that alignment, she found not limitation, but possibility. The freedom to honor her father's legacy while writing her own story, one choice at a time.